Welcome back, and we're so excited that you are staying on this journey with us. In this session, we are going to explore two macro policy frameworks. The one is a global framework called the Sustainable Development Goals, and the second is a very special African story. It's called Agenda 2063. We believe that both of these frameworks really go to the heart of how we can begin to think about alternative ways of imagining African cities, whilst also attending to the really profound problems that characterize most African cities. Now, to make sure we grasp the significance of these, it's important to just get to the same starting point. Firstly, the way policy works is that you have to have a lead. And we know that with the story of urbanization, it is really important for national governments to take lead action. The reason for this is that they sit with most of the resources, and they are also the one that provides the necessary support, guidance, and again, resources to city-level governments so that they can in fact implement the necessary actions to deal with the challenges of urbanization. Now, in the African context, we also have what we call Pan-African institutions. These are institutions that represent all African countries. At a political level, we've got the African Union. At a more technical level on economic policy, we've got the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And then a global body that has an Africa focus as well is the entity of the United Nations that is charged to deal with settlements and with cities in particular. It's called UN Habitat. And their job is to service national governments. And they play a really important role in helping national governments produce sharp, clear, and effective policy agendas. And this also allows citizens to hold governments accountable. And it allows governments to act in a way that they are accountable to their peers, to other nation states. Now, in addition to the government, in addition to states, there are non-state actors in civil society, in business, and academia. And we find in these domains many actors who are keen to promote sustainable urbanization policies and practices. But for them to be effective, they've got to pay very close attention to these Pan-African and global policy frameworks, because that's where they can lodge legitimacy for their actions, but that's also where they can exact accountability from nation states, Pan-African institutions, and the United Nations itself. So understanding these two policies is important because it helps us to build common ground between states, civil society, the business community, and of course, academia and the media. In this session, I'm going to delve into two of these that I think hold the greatest potential to unlock creativity and common purpose in dealing with urbanization in Africa, but also in the world. Now, let's start with Agenda 2063. And I must confess, and maybe this is an African bias, but I'm incredibly proud of what African leaders and African governments have done in putting together a sharp, clear, confident framework about where the continent should be going over the next 50 years. This is very importantly rooted in a deep and long tradition of Pan-Africanism, but also a more recent discourse, this idea that Africa's time has come, or the discourse that's called the African Renaissance. Because it marries these two powerful ideas, it provides a really robust framework for dealing not only with contemporary problems, but also past injustices. And it helps to use that knowledge of history to project Africa into the 21st century on its own terms, with confidence, with pride. And let me give you an example. This is an excerpt from this policy framework. And our leaders argue, we aspire that by 2063, Africa shall be a prosperous continent with the means and the resources to drive its own development, and where, importantly for our purposes in this course, cities and other settlements are hubs of cultural and economic activities with modernized infrastructure, and its people have access to all the basic necessities of life, including shelter, water, sanitation, energy, public transport, and crucially, ICT. Economies are structurally transformed to create shared growth, decent jobs, and economic opportunity for all. And I want you to pay attention to those two words, structurally transformed. And we'll come back to this theme because this is absolutely the hub of our thinking and our action if we really want to use our resources on the continent judiciously, but also for transformative purposes. Now, why I like Agenda 2063 so much is that it explicitly tries to draw on the best of our past, which is captured in indigenous knowledge systems, with the knowledge economy, which is enabled through digitalization. And it uses these two movements, if you will, of ideas to promote a platform for green industrialization in the pursuit of structurally transforming African economies. Structural transformation refers to the move to diversify away from primary sectors like mining or agriculture, so that we've got diverse economic sectors which offer many, many economic opportunities and also make African economies less vulnerable to the shocks of global demand. Now let's turn to the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is absolutely the most important reference point for global debate and policy, but also to insist on a unique development pathway for Africa. Now, what is this? In 2015, 150 world leaders traveled to New York, met at the United Nations headquarters, deliberated for 3 days, and all signed off on the Sustainable Development Goals as stretch targets for the global community, but to be achieved by 2030. In 2023, 193 member states of the UN have all signed the new agenda, which is called Transforming Our World 2030. And in this are 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets. Now, there's a few things in this ambitious agenda that I want to draw attention to. But for us to do that, we need to go back in history another 15 years. And that is to reflect on the difference between the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals. This was a global agreement also adopted by the United Nations in 2000 that established 8 goals that had to be achieved by 2015. So in fact, the SDGs is the successor agreement to the MDGs. Now, there are very important differences between these two frameworks. One, you can see the MDGs were shorter. There were only 8 goals, and the SDGs have 17. But the most important difference is that in the SDGs, a couple of taboos are now on the table to be discussed. The MDGs tended to only focus on poverty and how to relieve poverty. What the SDGs do, and that is uniquely different, it says we have to talk about inequality. We can't just talk about poverty, because the reason people are poor is connected to structural drivers of economic and other forms of inequality. Secondly, we've got to recognize that the current mode of economic production, consumption, and circulation of services and goods exceed what the planet can absorb in terms of resource extraction and in terms of pollution. And so the climate change emergency is the shorthand to remind us of these environmental limits. And thirdly, and this is perhaps most radical in the SDGs, it also then says, as a logical extension of those first 2 points, we need to fundamentally change the economic system, because at the moment it is not able to reproduce itself and be sustainable. Therefore, there is a specific goal that talks about sustainable production and consumption via industrial innovation. And this refers to a new school of economic thought called the circular economy. Now, all of this has relevance for how we think about cities. But before we get to that, and we'll explore it in other parts of this course as well, I want to just draw your attention to this concept of indigenous innovation, because this, for me, is the gift that these two frameworks offer us as Africans who are struggling to understand how to deal with the drivers of dysfunctional urbanization and how to move towards sustainable cities. And this is a recognition that indigenous knowledge live in everyday practices, and the innate intelligence of ordinary Africans who've got to negotiate life in the absence of infrastructure and services. We've got to ask a question. How does structural transformation of the economy connect or square with the SDGs and urbanization? Now, we believe the driver of the transition to sustainability will be to build our cities and our communities in a fundamentally different way. that imperative to transform how our cities function and what they look like is what should live at the heart of SDG 9 about innovation and infrastructure. But we also recognize unless society undergoes a cultural change and there's new kinds of demand that emerges for sustainable consumption and production, we won't have the impetus to build and design differently. We also believe that sustainable cities and communities, SDG 11, is the primary way to achieve the cluster of environmental goals related to climate, related to water, related to soil. And this, in fact, is the pathway to structurally transform our economies so that we can, in fact, have both local, national, and regional economies that is linked to decent work and sustained growth. And it is only by broadening that economic inclusion that we can attend to material disempowerment. In other words, all of the poverty-related goals related to food, access to energy, access to water, sanitation, and so forth. But, and this is the critical part, this doesn't happen as something that governments bestow on their populations. Political empowerment has to live at the heart of this transition. In other words, we've got to confront inequality, we've got to deal with gender inequality, and we've got to make sure that institutions across levels of government, across different actors in society, private sector, civil society, business, all work together to these common goals. And lastly, we can only advance transformative urban change if there are effective coalitions at the city scale where the action is to promote these next generation sustainable solutions.